So the content of the talk is to look at the nature of epistemic trust in science, and then try to come up with a moral dimension of this epistemic trust in science, and then apply the kind of analysis I give to the moral dimension to the case of public expert testimony. And if there's time, I'll look at the implication of this moral account for the norms of science communication. I'm not so sure there'll be time, but if there's time for the fourth. But the first three are quite important. Yeah, so Vilhot 2013 describes epistemic trust as having trust in a person as a provider of information. Then epistemic trust in expert becomes the act of trusting them or experts for relevant information to meet a non-expert's epistemic needs. So for example, trusting an expert concerning maybe the effects of excess cholesterol for one's health. So that is epistemic trust, as against my trusting my friend to water my plants when I'm on vacation. That's not epistemic trust. But trusting someone as a provider of information, and when it comes to experts, to meet my epistemic needs, is epistemic trust. In order to build this account of the moral dimension of epistemic trust in science, I want to give a brief background of the kind of debate that is going on within science. And Professor Maria alluded to some of the issues. So the epistemic dimension of trust within science has been well articulated in the context of scientific collaboration. And the underlying idea behind scientific collaboration and the sharing of knowledge within science is the notion of cognitive division of labor. The fact that because of time and resource constraints, we cannot all study everything. So we need to specialize. And if we end up specializing, then we would need to depend on others to get knowledge about other things, especially when we are collaborating on a joint project. We need to depend on our fellow collaborators. So the question becomes, when we engage in this kind of collaboration, do we invest epistemic trust as some kind of blind trust, or we do that based on some justified reasons, or some, as Elizabeth Fricker says in a 2002 paper, empirical warrant of their trustworthiness? So she says, and in this quote, that this is Elizabeth Fricker, I suggest scientists' basis for trusting each other lies in their knowledge of each other's commitment to and embedding within the norms and institutions of their profession. Unreliability is likely to be subsequently discovered and highly penalized in such a setting. And this gives one strong empirical reason, amongst others, to expect informants to be trustworthy. So she's dependent on the institutions of science, the self-correcting nature of science, to be able to weed out bad science. And she says that because of this framework, and also because of the institution of science, fellow scientists have this empirical warrant or justification to trust the claims of fellow scientists. In a recent paper in 2021, Magite also makes a similar argument. He suggests that the norms of competence, conscientiousness, and honesty are intrinsic epistemic values in science, and should therefore provide epistemic reasons for scientists to accept the claims of their colleagues. So because of these factors, which he considers epistemic values, scientists are justified in accepting the claims of fellow scientists, especially in a collaboration. Frost Arnold, in a later paper, acknowledges that in the prevailing account of trust within science, it is held that the self-interest of scientists, which prevents them from tainting their reputation due to fraudulent work, and the desire to be rewarded for excellent work, motivates their trustworthiness and therefore establishes the rationale for trusting the work of fellow scientists. So she's alluding to the fact that there's this self-interest that scientists have, such that they want to protect their reputation. So if a scientist wants to protect his reputation, he would not want to do something that would taint his image. And he also wants to do good science in order to get the the acclamation. And this is within the institutional framework of science. So because of this, if I'm a scientist, I'm confident to trust the work of my colleague, because in my mind, I think my colleague has this preservation of their self-interest at heart, such that they will not deceive me. Christina Rowling, in her paper Scientific Community, a Moral Dimension, notes that it is part of the dominant thinking within science that scientists are motivated to be epistemically responsible in their work solely because of advancing knowledge. So she says that within this traditional framework of science, scientists collaborating with each other believe that their colleagues want to advance knowledge. And so that is the motivation for being trustworthy. That is the motivation for doing good science, because they want to advance knowledge. But then they say that is, Rowling and Frost Arnold say, that's not the only motivation for scientists to provide reliable information to their colleagues. They acknowledge a moral motivation also. So they say moral motivations, let me just quote it. They go on to show in separate works that apart from self-interest and the desire to promote epistemic ends, scientists also have moral motivations for being epistemically responsible. So there's a moral motivation for doing good science, moral motivation for providing reliable information. However, this moral dimension has been less explored in philosophy of science, and both of their papers are like the few ones that really talk about this within the context of scientific collaboration. So let's keep that thought and let's come to how this concept of epistemic trust in science is conceived. Is it a matter of relying on my colleagues for knowledge, or is it a matter of trusting my colleague for knowledge? Some people believe that if my colleague is an expert in the field, has the qualifications, I'm actually relying on them to do good science. I'm not actually trusting them to do some good science. So is it reliance or trust? There's this very long quote by Thorsten Wilhort. He says that there arises the possibility of an enhanced kind of epistemic reliance based on the assumption of shared ideas about the values of true results and the dangers inherent in errors. This kind of reliance presupposes much more than just that other scientists work dependably and professionally in keeping with the rules of the trade. It presupposes that they have the right attitude towards what they are doing, an attitude whose absence might be considered not just regrettable, but to a certain degree blameworthy. I, therefore, Thorsten, suggest that this enhanced kind of epistemic reliance would be truly deserving of the name of epistemic trust. It is, after all, a kind of relying that makes me dependent on another's working from the right value judgment. So he introduces values in this kind of collaboration. So he is saying that I have a reason to trust the results of my colleague because I believe, or I assume within the scientific framework, that my colleague also shares the consequences of errors. So if I am a scientist, what he also says, so to do that, you have to look out for these things, these signs in your colleagues. So is your colleague one who is worried about a false positive or a false negative? Is your colleague worried about endorsing hypotheses that will end up being false? If your colleague is worried or has that shares this value, then we have a reason to trust their claims, because they have this kind of shared value judgment when it comes to the consequences of making mistakes. So we have a reason to trust. So he says this is actually trust, not reliance, because of shared values. So back to Frost, Arnold, and Rowling. They argue that in communicating with their colleagues, so scientists communicating with their colleagues, scientists are not only motivated by self-interest or epistemic reasons, but by moral motivations as well. And for Frost, Arnold, and Rowling, it is this moral motivation which gives colleagues the reason to trust each other's testimony. And Rowling says that and the point she makes really is that the moral duty for Rowling stems from the respect accorded to one's colleague as a knower. So if you are all in an epistemic community, there is this moral motivation to provide trustworthy claims because we respect our colleagues as knowers. So this is this kind of moral dimension she's bringing in. A respect for my colleague as a knower gives me a moral motivation to be epistemically responsible in providing reliable information to my colleague. So this is what is happening within science, within a collaboration. But now I'm trying to extend it to scientists and then the public, non-experts. And in a paper by Ezek and Kotomos, they say that for the public to have warranted basic epistemic trust in science, these conditions must be in place. So a scientist believes that P, where P is a scientific claim, and honestly, that is truthfully, accurately, and wholly, communicates it to M, who is a member of the public, either directly or indirectly. M, who is a member of the public, takes the fact that S, scientist, believes and has communicated that P to be a reason to believe that P is the output of reliable scientific research carried out by S, and M relies on S because she has good reasons to believe that P is the output of such research and that S has communicated P honestly. So they say that when these conditions are in place, the public has warranted basic epistemic trust in science. But then they go a step further and say this basic trust is not complete, especially in cases where public welfare is at stake. We need something more. So they add two more premises to the four they have already. And they say that when public welfare is at stake in making methodological decisions regarding the distribution of inductive risks with respect to P, S makes those decisions in agreement with M's assessment of the inductive risks in question. And M has reason to believe that condition 5 is satisfied. So basic epistemic trust, as we saw, the first 4 points, plus these two conditions, yield what they call the public's warranted enhanced epistemic trust in science. And they take a cue from Torsten Wilhot by introducing these values that when it comes to cases where public welfare is at stake, in order for the public to have enhanced epistemic trust in science, the public's assessment of inductive risks, as in risks of false positive and false negatives, the effect of making a wrong claim, agrees with how the scientists also consider the consequences of making errors. So, and they say this can be done through hybrid forums, through diversity meetings with different sections of the public, such that we have an interaction with the experts, and then we get to feel whether the experts feel what we feel, not so much to influence their findings, but to get a sense whether they are sympathetic to the kind of consequences that might come about if an experiment or if a hypothesis is wrongly accepted. And they say because of that, after that kind of deliberation, the public can be satisfied if really this aligns, their values and the values of the expert aligns, then they can have enhanced epistemic trust in science. So now to this moral dimension to non-expert epistemic trust in science, which I want to tease out of this epistemic trust relationship. So my claim is that the relationship of epistemic dependence, this is a term from John Hardwick, and this epistemic dependence, which characterizes the epistemic trust relationship between experts and non-experts, provides a good ground to establish a moral obligation on experts to be epistemically responsible to non-experts. So we've shifted from collaboration, where Rowling says that experts respect their colleagues as knowers, so because of that, they are morally motivated to provide good information, to do good science. So now we are shifting it to scientists and then non-scientists, the public. And my claim is that the public depend on experts, and there's this epistemic dependence. And I'm saying that because of this epistemic dependence, we can tease out some moral motivations for scientists to provide reliable information. This specific kind of moral obligation, which is established by an epistemic trust relationship, does not apply to all scientists in general, but only to those scientists who act as experts on particular topics and who, by virtue of various speech acts, such as telling, advising, reporting, or advocating, invite trust from their audience. And Goodwin, Hinchman say that telling is inviting trust, advising is inviting trust. So when we tell people something, we invite their trust. When we advise, we invite them to trust us. So the moral dimension of epistemic trust is seen in the moral obligation which accrues to experts because they have invited the trust of non-experts who have responded to this invitation by trusting them. And I appeal to Philip Nickel, who writes that trusting someone is also a form of obligation ascription. So according to Nickel, the act of trusting ascribes an obligation on the trustee, and such an obligation is expected to motivate performance. Nickel argues that it is because of the feature of obligation ascription inherent in trust relationships which serves as the ground for blame or praise. So if I trust you to provide information for me, according to Nickel, I've ascribed an obligation on you to provide this information to me. And this is the reason why in most cases, when you don't provide this kind of reliable information, I can blame you, or when you do provide, I praise you. I also build on Paul Faulkner's notion of affective trust. And Faulkner provides the following conditions to be in place for affective trust to hold. A trusts X to phi in the affective sense if and only if A knowingly depends on S fine. So A is a member of the public. A knowingly depends on the scientist providing reliable information. And the member of the public expects the experts knowing that I, a member of the public, depend on S providing information to motivate S to phi. Faulkner says that failure on the part of the trustee to honor the trust of the truster makes the trustee susceptible to certain reactive attitudes. And the common reactive attitude that follows a dishonoring of trust is resentment. So this is just my argument. So I argue that when non-experts trust scientific experts for reliable information, they enter into an affective trust relationship with them, where they expect that the expert's recognition that they depend on her for reliable scientific information should motivate her to provide this information. It is the recognition on the part of experts that lay persons depend on them for reliable information, which serves as the ground of their moral obligation to do so based on Faulkner's account of affective trust. So application in the context of public health experts. The kind of public health experts I have in mind are those who are not appointed by policymakers to provide policy advice, but those who feel the need to contribute their knowledge on particular public health topics to the broader society. So some of these experts are invited by the media to be on television, on radio, to provide expert advice on pertinent issues. I argue that by presenting themselves as experts, they invite trust from the public by telling, so speech out of telling, the public that P, for example, P being public health information, for example, that wearing a mask protects against COVID-19, or reporting that P or advising that P. So by virtue of the fact that a scientist presents herself as an expert and goes ahead to make claims which tend to invite trust from a relevant group of non-experts, an epistemic trust relationship is forged, and a moral obligation to honor the trust invested in expert follows from this relationship based on the account I've given by Paul Faulkner and the account by Philip Nickel. So an important reason why this is the case is that the information that the trusted expert provides can bring benefits or harms to her audience if that claim is believed and acted on. So an affective trust relationship, as described by Faulkner, is evident in such scenarios. This holds true because, so bearing in mind the conditions that Faulkner has in place. Point 1, members of the public knowingly depend on the public expert for relevant information. We know our shortcomings when it comes to signs and we knowingly depend on them. So this condition is fulfilled. 2, they expect the expert's recognition that they depend on her to provide this information to motivate her to do so. And therefore, distorting information, misleading or misinforming the public who depend on you for reliable information is bound to arouse feelings of resentment, which is evidence that a moral relationship of trust was already at play.